Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And the Bible calls us as Christians to be salt and light in the world. We are to bring that saltiness, we're to bring that light into our culture to hopefully change culture and protect people. And we are living in a time where culture is a bit crazy. We have the redefinition of marriage. We have the redefinition of what male and female is. We have people advocating for radical abortion policies. These are Genesis 1 issues. These are creation ordinance issues. But our Christian witness isn't just kept to those issues, but we as Christians should be able to speak on everything from immigration policies to social justice. And that doesn't mean we can't have good faith discussions on what those different policies should look like. But the principles behind what's motivating so much of this, we as Christians, we have the authority of God's word, which we go to inform us of what to think about some of these things. And we have a guest today that has written a book called Toxic Empathy: How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion. It's Allie Beth Stuckey. I'm a huge fan of Allie. I think she's one of the most courageous, biblically balanced voices out there. And she takes a lot of hits. There are a lot of false narratives about her out there, but I think she's doing a fabulous job. I loved this book. I endorsed this book. I said it's the book for this cultural moment. We're going to talk about some of those issues today. What is toxic empathy? What does it mean when we look at how people on the more progressive side of things, whether that be theologically, politically, ethically, culturally, how they are influencing more conservative Christians to be silent, to be really quiet about some of these topics and what the Bible has to say about what we should, how we should speak into these topics. I had some really big highlights from this episode. I asked Allie about being called a dangerous Christian nationalist. I asked her about being compared to a Nazi German soldier by Russell Moore in Christianity Today here recently. And I really wanted her to comment on those things because I think that when you are bold for Christ in this culture, people are going to call you names. They're going to say things about you. And what they're saying about her today, what they might be saying about me today, is what they're going to be saying about you tomorrow if you're bold and you really speak up. So I hope that this episode encourages you. I hope it equips you to have language to address some of these topics and be able to parse them in their proper categories. We talked about the role of pietism and how that kind of came to be in America and really caused a lot of Christians to think that the God-given institution of government is really something that's secular. That's not something we should really be speaking into. Whereas we know biblically God gave us government and there's a certain way he wants things to go and how we can think about those things as Christians. So I hope you get a lot out of this episode. I loved it. I loved getting to talk with Allie Beth. And here it is. Well, Allie, welcome back to the podcast. So glad to have you back on, not only
Thank
because you're
you.
just such a clear and good voice in the world right now, but because you've just written this amazing book called Toxic Empathy: How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion. This book I endorsed, and I called it the book for this cultural moment. And I really meant that because the topics that you're addressing in this book are so eye-opening because I think, of course, I knew that these topics were surrounding our theological discussions as Christians, but you've really pinpointed this idea of toxic empathy. Talk about that, and then we'll dig down into some of these particular issues. But the whole idea of how progressives exploit Christian compassion, how did you come up with that?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for your endorsement. It meant a lot to me. I started thinking about this concept, I guess, in the summer of 2020. There was a convergence of a lot of things happening. Everyone remembers it was the wake of George Floyd, it was COVID, it was an election year, a very contentious election year. And I was surprised hearing a lot of fellow evangelicals, even those that are considered conservative evangelicals, really kind of mimic the mottos of the world when it came to so-called racial and social justice. So there was the black square, but then there was also things like riots are the voice of the unheard, or we need to renounce our white privilege, and repeating words like systemic racism that I had really never heard before. And I started examining, okay, where are these claims coming from? Are they factually true? Are the policy prescriptions like defunding the police? Are they good? And most importantly, are they biblical? Like this message that we are hearing preached, it seems to be one gospel to white people, another gospel
Mm.
to black people, a lot of partiality. And when I started kind of challenging this and just asking questions in private and in public to Christians that I still admire, but really admired then, I kept on hearing this word over and over again. And it was empathy. And I was actually told on multiple occasions that sometimes the truth or the facts really don't matter when what's most important is that we are led by empathy and that we lead with empathy. I heard a lot of we should vote with empathy. And I was thinking, like, if empathy is leading people to say or affirm things that aren't true, that could then lead to policies that are ultimately harmful, like soft on crime policies, lawlessness, defunding the police, then maybe empathy isn't a good guide. So, where did this idea come from? And what does it look like? And I realized that it wasn't just on this subject of social justice, which is a hard topic. I'm not acting like it is simple. But I noticed that the same simple formula was used when it came to social justice as with all these other topics like abortion, like gender, like sexuality and immigration. And it was basically, we can get into it in more detail, but capitalizing on our natural compassion or our call as Christians to be loving by evoking sympathy or empathy for a particular victim, and then using that empathy to manipulate us into affirming what that victim wants or the policy prescription that the media tells us will help that victim. And so, like I said, I saw that in every subject, and that's why I wanted to write the book.
Well, you were asking questions you weren't nobody was supposed to be asking, but yet we were all thinking inside. So I remember,
Mm,
and you opened your book this way talking about that black square because I remember, I mean, tensions were so high. Nobody wants to be racist. We want to solve racism, right? Racism, the sin of racism, we want to get rid of that. And then these black squares started showing up on Instagram. And I remember thinking, like, nothing about this feels right. But
yeah.
yet they're presenting this as the only empathetic response. And so I remember I just didn't post it. I just thought, you know what, this will pass. Well, it didn't pass. And of course, those narratives get formed into other things. And I'd love for you to talk about something because it's related to this issue. You and I were at the Prestonwood Biblical Worldview Conference the week before the Share the Arrows event, which was
Yeah.
congratulations, by the way. That was
Oh,
such an
thank you.
amazing. I still meet people at different conferences who came from somewhere across the
Aw,
country
I
and
love
flew
that.
there. I know, I love it too. And they
I
made a
love that.
girls' weekend of it. But it was
Yes.
so fun and it was so good. But you said something the week before on a panel discussion that we were on together. And the question was, what are you most concerned about in the church today? And then what are you most encouraged by? You said something for what you're most concerned about that I thought was so profound. I've not stopped thinking about it since. I have quoted you, and I've probably not quoted you correctly because I was doing my best to remember what you said. But I would love for you to unpack that a little bit more. You said what you're
Could
so
you
concerned
remind
about.
me?
I'm
Okay.
going to remind you. Yeah. It was the compartmentalization that Christians
Mm,
do. So, like, we compartmentalize our ethics from our politics, from our theology, from maybe how we think about culture. And I just, that to me, you articulated something that I've been thinking a lot about, but had never really put into words. And I think it's really powerful. So, talk about why that's such a concern for you right now.
yes, I think that we have, as Christians, we kind of have a poor understanding of what it even means to have a worldview that word is obviously all encompassing. How do you view the world? Of course, that includes culture, that includes politics, that includes parenting, that includes interpersonal relationships. That doesn't mean that all of those things are on the same level or that the Bible has clear cut answers on all the intricacies of all of those categories. But biblical principles should inform how we think of all of these things. And really, it's only Christian conservatives who have been told, and in many cases have imbibed this idea that our faith has to be compartmentalized over here, and then we vote with a completely different worldview, with a completely different belief system. And we're not allowed to bring what we believe about right and wrong, male and female, into the classroom, into the school board meeting, into our workplace, and into the voting booth. And we've been told that when Christian conservatives do that, it's Christian nationalism, it's the handmaid's tale, it's theocratic fascism, Christofascism, all of these crazy words. But of course, when Kamala Harris goes to a Souls to the Polls event, she gives an entire sermon that basically likens herself to coming prophet or even a messiah like figure that's going to save Black America, it's going to save basically Western civilization. You don't hear writers at the Atlantic saying, oop, this is scary Christian nationalism. This is Christofascism. We need to worry about that. And so even the so called progressive Christian understands that what they believe has to inform every choice they make. The progressive goes into every space and says, how can I conform this space to my
Yeah.
beliefs? How can I change what this school thinks about gender to conform what I believe about gender? How can I change the policies at my workplace to conform to what I think about gender, what I think about race, whatever it is? The Christian conservative, though, we have been successfully shut up into believing that it is neutral and democratic of us to leave our worldview at home. And I am not a theocrat. Like, I believe in America. I say, let the best idea win, but don't leave your ideas at home, Christian. Like,
Yeah.
if God is the God of the universe, if he is the authority over all things, and if he is love, and if he is good, all of the things that every Christian would affirm, then we have to believe that his ways are better. They're better for our neighbor. They're better for the immigrant. They're better for every person in every realm of society. And we have every right, and I even argue the responsibility to bring the fullness of our biblical worldview into every sphere that we occupy.
And it's such a brilliant way of shutting Christians up if you really think about it. It's like the particular type of name calling. For example, you have been called a dangerous Christian nationalist. You have been compared to a Nazi. And I think
Yeah.
it's stunning to me because when I engage with your content, which I do quite often, to me, you are one of the most balanced, even gentle voices that are promoting the biblical word. It blows my mind when this kind of stuff happens. But
Thank
I
you.
wanted to make that point because I think that the task of discerning the times is getting more and more difficult because it's one thing, when I came out with another gospel and I was talking about progressive Christianity, pretty much the evangelical church was just fine with naming people like Rob Bell and Brian McLaren and maybe Nadia Boltz-Weber because they're so out there. They're saying things that are so radically different. But today, the task of discerning that progressive influx is so much more difficult. And I think you're doing a brilliant job at that, despite the names that you're
Yeah.
being called, which are so ridiculous. But who, like in the evangelical church, who are you concerned about? If you feel comfortable maybe saying some names of people that you're like, okay, that person is very obviously kind of sliding into progressivism, but people are having a hard time accepting that because it's not like a Rob Bell that's just seems to be so out there. Have you started thinking about Thanksgiving yet? I know I have because Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. And this is where Good Ranchers has you covered. When you subscribe to any one of their boxes that have grass-fed beef, better than organic chicken, heritage breed pork, and wild-caught seafood, they are going to throw in a free Thanksgiving ham in your first delivery. That's a 10-pound spiral cut ham, which is a $110 value completely free. And by the way, this is heritage breed pork, which is such high quality, way better than what you're going to get in the grocery store. And I don't know if you've noticed this too, but the prices are going up in the grocery store while the quality is going down. And there's not a lot of transparency. You don't always know where your meat's coming from. With Good Ranchers, it's 100% American, born, raised, and harvested. No antibiotics, no hormones or seed oils, steakhouse quality, saves you time and money. It's a no-brainer. So go to goodranchers.com to subscribe today and use my code Alisa to get that free holiday ham plus free express shipping. Again, that's goodranchers.com. Use my code Alisa.
Yeah. I mean, There's so many. There's a lot of people in what I call the mushy middle, and then some
Mm,
people who have just kind of basically declared themselves on the left. I would say even until a few years ago, conservative Baptist churches were inviting Russell Moore into their congregations to preach. And
yep,
you mentioned that I'm being likened to a Nazi. Well, that was Russell Moore in the pages of Christianity Today in a very passive aggressive way because he didn't like how I interpreted a verse in Matthew 25. I said a very mainstream view that when Jesus is saying the least of these, he's actually talking about persecuted Christians. Now, Christians are called to care for the poor elsewhere, but in that particular passage, he is talking about how we treat his people is basically how we treat him. And Russell Moore said that that's basically an interpretation that a 20th century German soldier would have, which is an
yep,
absolutely like, it's so absurd, it's hard to even engage with it. But that's someone who's coming out and saying basically that he is progressive. And I would have said just politically, but now I'm wondering if he is progressive theologically completely as well. And so I'd say anyone in that camp, anyone who is in that after party curriculum.
yep,
I also caution against an organization like the AND campaign, which coincidentally is run by all registered Democrats. And that's not to say that Christians can't have in good faith discussions about politics, because not every policy or political discussion comes down to the created order, but enough do at this point for us to say the two sides aren't the same. There's a lot of daylight between the two sides. So, really, any pastor who gets up there and their election sermon is saying, well, both sides are bad and politics can't save us. Okay, that might be one part of the sermon. That can't be the point, because we are looking, all Christians, myself included, for moral clarity. It's a very chaotic time.
yeah,
It's a confusing time. I think some pastors think that their moral relativism about politics is bold and courageous, and it's really not. Like, you don't have to endorse a candidate. You don't even have to say, hey, you got to vote Republican. But let's go through the issues that are talked about in Genesis 1. Let's go through what Genesis 1:27 says about the value of life from the moment of the creation of humanity on. Let's go through what the Bible says about gender. Let's go through what the Bible says about marriage. When those things are messed up further, when they are institutionalized and enshrined as a right in the United States, disorder and chaos ensue. Which party seems to be most endorsing institutionalizing disorder and death and destruction of the family and chaos? There is one party that is more closely aligned with that chaos. It is true that both parties are imperfect and neither party is salvific. That is absolutely true. But which, I heard a pastor say this, which party is going to best stem the tide of evil?
yeah.
I want pastors that are going to go up there and be clear about that. The pastors that are wishy washy about that, that just can't say it. I just think I want to give grace and give the benefit of the doubt, but gosh, people want clarity, and if you can't give them that, they're going to get it elsewhere. And that seems to me a high responsibility of a shepherd to give his sheep clarity. So anyone who is unwilling to do that, I think probably needs to be veered away from.
Yeah, I agree with you on Russell Moore. I think he's the one to watch right now as far as sliding into progressivism, which you're not supposed to say his name. That's the thing about this whole thing that kind of bothers me is in the name of empathy, there are people that are sort of untouchable, the evangelical royalty. And look, I'm not saying he's not a Christian. I'm not saying any of that. It's just in my experience of watching church after church, organization after organization slide off of the progressive Christian hill. I've seen it happen many, many, many times. This is what I'm seeing happen. And it doesn't mean he's not a Christian, but it doesn't mean you have to follow him either. And guys like him and David French, who are very obviously maybe more politically motivated, like you mentioned, than they are theologically motivated, but the theology is going to follow when that sort of toxic empathy and that political persuasion is upheld, the theology is going to crumble underneath it. And it does every single time. And
Yes.
you even mentioned, that was such a mainstream view. Kevin DeYoung takes that view. Denny Burke takes that view. So in essence, he would be also comparing Denny Burke and Kevin DeYoung, who are very balanced biblical voices in this
Yeah.
world, I think, comparing them also to a Nazi soldier in
John
Germany.
Calvin
And John
John
Calvin,
Calvin,
right, right.
Augustine, and actually I found an article from Christianity Today in
Oh,
2015 that makes the same argument. So really, I mean, what you're getting to is exactly right. I think what bothered him, I think this is just my this is my assumption because in the tweet, my original post said, because I hear Democrats say a lot, and you've pointed this out, that progressive Christians allow their politics to drive their theology, not the other way around. And so I hear a lot the justification of Christians who vote Democrat by saying, I'm voting for the least of these. I'm voting for
mhm,
the marginalized. And I said, look, I'm actually voting for the least of these because the least of these is Jack Phillips. The least of these is the persecuted Christian who, for the sake of biblical values, has been absolutely harassed and a victim of lawfare by progressive activists for the past 12 years. So when I'm actually looking to vote on behalf of the least of these persecuted Christians, I want to vote for the party that best upholds their liberty, that's not going to put pro lifers in prison the way the Harris Biden administration is, but it's going to pardon those people. That's like Romans 13. Governments are instituted by God to reward good and punish evil. I see the Harris Biden administration doing the opposite. So that's basically what my tweet is about. And I think what made Russell Moore mad, because Russell Moore's not dumb. He's very smart. He's an excellent writer. He knows the Bible. I know he knows the Bible. He was not unaware that Calvin and Augustine and DeYoung and Denny Burke and Christianity Today argued the same thing that I did about what the least of these men. What I think he was mad at, and what he didn't include in his article because it would have given it away, is that I undermined the progressive dogma that
mm,
he and many others use to justify voting Democrat. Because when you take away what really is the only pseudo Christian argument to vote for the party of unfettered abortion, well, then you've got nothing. Because you hear that a lot from, well, yeah, sure, Republicans kind of get it right on abortion, but all of these other groups over here, Democrats get it right on those things. And they use that least of these first to justify that. When you take that away, well, then his entire thing, his entire justification for being progressive crumbles. So I personally, if I were to assume, um, I think that that's really what he was upset by.
mhm. And I read the article that he wrote, and what was sort of concerning to me, on top of all the things we've already talked about, was the way in which he went about defending his interpretation. There was no appeal to the original language. There was no appeal to church history and how
Mhm.
church fathers interpreted this verse. It was very rhetorical. It was very empathy driven. Like, that's the primary way you're going to interpret all these verses, is through this sort of lens of empathy. And well, we don't have to think of it that way because we can use it this way. That was ultimately, as far as I could tell, his reasoning,
You're
is like,
right.
well, we can use it this way. And so that to me is very concerning. Even, like, if people are getting uncomfortable right now because we're getting into the political sphere, which again, we can't compartmentalize these things. We should be able, as Christians with a biblical worldview, to be able to comment on everything in culture. If there's anything that in culture comes around where you're not supposed to say it because you're a Christian, that's a huge red flag. That's a huge
Mhm.
red flag that we're being silenced for a reason that isn't a good one, because we should be able to, from a Christian worldview, comment on anything that we're asked about. And so
Yeah,
that really concerned me, was
totally.
his actual tactic, because that's a very progressive theological tactic that you kind of see that those underpinnings unraveling there. Well, I
You're
am
totally right.
grateful for you and for the hits that you take, and
Thank
I,
you.
I think it's important for people to hear that stuff, because if they are going to speak out and be a biblical Christian in this culture, they're going to be called some of those things and compared to some of those things as well.
Yeah.
And so it's good to keep that in
And
mind.
it is important. And I try to remember too, because look, I no one likes to be called those things. Like, no one
Mm-mm.
likes to be told, I didn't like in 2020 when I was told that I didn't have empathy, or you're called a racist for not posting a black square. No one wants to be called those things. I don't want to act like I'm like, yeah, I don't care that Russell Moore likened me to a Nazi in the pages of Christianity Today. Like, I'm a mom of three just trying to navigate the craziness of this world. I don't want to be called that. I don't want to purposely create enemies. But for all of us, whether it's small, someone saying something rude about you, or whether it's major persecution that Christians around the world are dealing with, like, we have to remember Jesus's fate, not his ultimate fate and, ascending to heaven, but his fate in crucifixion. We have to remember Stephen. Stephen was stoned to death for sharing the gospel. I think sometimes we think, well, if I just tell the truth, then they'll believe me because it's true, and they can't be mad about that. People get really mad at the truth, and he is described as being full of grace and truth. I would love to be described as full of grace.
Hmm.
So he was full of grace. He shared the gospel, and they got so angry that he shared the gospel with them that they picked up stones and they stoned him to death. And I think we think that we live in a different age where we can somehow escape hate. And if we're nice enough, and if we're winsome enough, and if we kind of, ride the fence enough, then everyone will like us. But everyone who desires to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted to
Yeah.
one degree or another. Jesus said, they will hate you because of me. And I don't want to conflate the gospel with politics, but anything that is in line with a biblical worldview, that the Bible says is true, when you represent that and you get lambasted for it in one way or another, that is a form of persecution that we are promised. And so we can just take comfort in that, that is contributing for us a far greater glory that far outweighs all of this.
Maybe you're looking for an alternative to some of the big box curriculums that are offered for your next gen ministry at your church or even for your own homeschool curriculum. I want to introduce you to Foundation Worldview curriculum. We've used this in our home and it is absolutely fabulous. It gives our kids a biblical worldview as they encounter all sorts of craziness in a culture that's really trying to indoctrinate them into some very unbiblical values. Right now, they've got their Studying the Bible curriculum, which really solves a big problem. We tend to do all the planning and Bible instruction for our kids, but that can actually leave them lacking the skills they need to study the Bible on their own. And so studying the Bible curriculum from Foundation Worldview solves that problem by giving 10 lessons on helping kids grasp the major periods in Bible history. Then there's 10 lessons focused on Bible study skills. And then finally, 10 lessons exploring how to read different biblical genres correctly. So go to foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa to get 10% off of any family license that they offer. Again, that's foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa. Yeah. And one of the things your book did as I read through it is I honestly, of course, I realize there's a crisis at the border and there's things that need to change. But I didn't realize till I read your book how deeply theological that question is as well. And I love
Mhm.
how you even start that chapter and really several of the chapters with stories that really um, draw out your empathy on both sides. So talk
Yeah.
about that chapter because I think that's something that for me it really challenged me to think of it through more of a theological lens even. As a
Yeah.
Christian, how do I view what's going on at the border and then even taking into account the stories that you shared?
Yeah. So the first 3 chapters were, very easy to write, and that it's very black and white. Like, those are creation order issues when we go through abortion, when we go through gender, when we go through the definition of marriage. Then we get to 2 issues, immigration and social justice, that aren't necessarily created order issues, but I think the Bible does speak clearly on. Maybe not when we get into the nitty-gritty of policy, which I think that we can disagree in good faith, but the general principles of borders and parameters and walls and security, I do think that we see very clearly throughout scripture. Yes, I do want to show people the personal side, the human side of illegal immigration, that there are women, moms fleeing for a better life. But that's the only side that we ever hear. And that is when our empathy can draw us to supporting open borders or liberal immigration policy, because the only stories that we think of is the poor Colombian woman fleeing gang violence. But on the other side of it, we have Kate Steinle. Kate Steinle was a young woman when she was 32 years old. She was walking down a pier with her father in San Francisco one afternoon, and she was shot in the back. Her dad held her as she took her last breath, and she managed to utter, "Help me, daddy." But she died right then because an illegal immigrant who had been deported 5 times but had been shielded from another deportation because of the sanctuary city policies that were championed by Kamala Harris and other progressive politicians. He shot her and he killed her. She should be a mom living her life and thriving right now, but instead she was murdered. And that is the thing with every single crime, every rape, every assault, every murder by an illegal immigrant, is that it's a preventable crime. No, not all illegal immigrants are going to commit additional crimes, but they're all preventable crimes. And so on both sides of the issue, we have people that demand our empathy. But the question is, in every chapter, not just who gets our empathy, because on every side of every issue, there's someone who gets our empathy,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
what is true? And in the Bible, we see very clearly that everywhere a wall is mentioned when it comes to a city, it is literally or metaphorically a symbol of protection and provision and security and stability. A man without self control is likened to a city without walls. That means you are very vulnerable to attack. And actually, when we look at the beginning, God places man in a garden, not in a jungle, but a garden with parameters that is meant to be worked and to be kept and to be cultivated. We see that heaven itself has walls. Walls are symbols of security. God placed us in a country, God placed us in a nation with a government. Those were his ideas. Laws were his ideas. And so all of these things are for the safety, security, and the flourishing of human beings. And I go so far as to say you can either support the unmitigated and unvetted infiltration of illegal immigrants, or you can care for your neighbor, but you cannot do both. So that's that actually that chapter, I was so passionate as I was writing it because I also did not realize the huge human cost, both to the migrants themselves and to the citizens of this country, of illegal immigration.
Why do you think it is that in other countries it's like okay to have security and that sort of
Right.
thing, but yet when America does it, it's off the table?
Yeah, I think it is this acceptance of this. I know that people thought this was overused in 2020, even though it's a true academic term and it's an accurate description of what a lot of people believe, but it's this critical race theory idea that white oppressor, black and brown people oppressed, and therefore, in all cases, whenever white people try to enforce laws or what they would say assert dominance or even enforce their borders, this is an act of oppression. This is an act of supremacy. This is an act of racism. They would say we live on stolen land. This is a colonized land that wasn't ours to begin with, and therefore we have no right to tell people that they can't come here. But of course, the reality is, and this is true in every conversation that is driven by critical race theory, is that the entire history of the world is oppressed versus oppressors, in every people group of every different ethnicity and skin color has been on the side of the enslaved or the enslaver, the oppressed or the oppressor. If you go back far enough, I mean, every land virtually has been conquered. And so that's really not how we can judge whether something is right or wrong, just or unjust. We have to look at the facts that we have now, be as impartial as possible, look to the principles of scripture, and vote for, support the policies that best support order.
Yeah. And I'd love for you to speak to somebody who might be watching us or listening to us thinking, gosh, I mean, I agree with you in principle. You know, in my heart, that's kind of what I think. but I just wanna stay out of politics. I wanna stay out of
Yeah.
trying to bring my ethics into somebody else's life, which is really like, I've been learning a lot about the history of pietism in the US, that really
Mm,
that was, a group of Christians that decided that politics and government was this other unspiritual thing, like, we're spiritual,
yeah.
and that really has almost like this created this divide where it's like part of you is spiritual and part of you is everything else, which is what you're really talking about with that compartmentalization. But what would you say to a Christian who might be just kind of uncomfortable with the way that we're talking about politics and all of these
Yeah.
topics?
I totally understand where this person is coming from. I think I've had a lot of those people in my audience. A friend typically sends them an episode, they start listening, and I think at first they are a little bit uncomfortable. But for that group, I created an alliteration many years ago that I repeat all the time, and it's politics matter because policy matters because people matter. Politics affects policy, policy affects people, and people matter. This is not some abstract issue, but the representatives that we have in office and the laws that are put in place have a real effect on people, on their ability to live, on their livelihood. And now we are seeing that in a very fundamental theological way when we see, for example, that California passed a law that says if parents don't affirm a child's so called gender identity, that child can be taken out of their custody. I've actually seen the effects of that in talking to some of those parents in states across the country when we are looking at the Harris Biden administration imprisoning pro lifers. Bevelyn Williams, Joan Bell is a 74-year-old grandmother who stood in front of the entrance of an abortion clinic, and she is serving 3 years in federal prison right now. The people that we elect have a real effect on people. They
Yeah.
have a real effect on vulnerable people, specifically on children. When you have an administration whose Health and Human Services Department is sending out recommended guidelines for so called trans children that includes chemical castration. We're talking puberty blockers in 10-year-old boys, or even double mastectomies for young girls. That is happening in hospitals, it's documented across the country. That matters. That's affecting real people. That's affecting their bodies. I know of a young woman named Daisy Strongen. She's a Christian now and she has children and she's a beautiful young woman, but she was allowed to transition, so called, as a teenager, got a double mastectomy, and she has two kids now, but she still struggles
Mm.
so much because she can't breastfeed her babies. If there
Yeah.
had been some kind of law,
Yeah.
like a law can be such a grace from God that protected her, that said, no, doctors, you're not allowed to do that, she would be whole and healed because she's realized since then that she's really a woman. When I hear that awful story of Amber Thurman, the woman in Georgia who had to drive to North Carolina to get abortion pills, who was pregnant with twins, who ended up dying herself because of complications from the abortion pill. If there had been a law banning the abortion pill, all
Yeah.
three of those image bearers would be alive. And so there, God came up with laws. They were his
Mhm.
idea. The government was
Mhm.
his idea. And if our worldview is not going to influence laws, someone else's will. And so
Yeah.
politics is not the primary way to love your neighbor, but it is a way to love your neighbor.
Well, just in time for your Christmas shopping, I'm so excited to tell you about SPERO Natural Goods. They make all sorts of body products, deodorants, soaps, and all of it is 100% natural. They don't use artificial chemicals, scents, or colorants. All of the scents come from essential oils, and the colors are all from herbs and clays. All of their body products are also anhydrous, and that means they don't have any water in them, which makes them really rich and creamy and concentrated. My favorite products from SPERO are their soaps. Their soaps are made from all sorts of amazing ingredients like goat milk, raw kefir, herbal teas, and they're meticulously crafted through the time-honored cold process method. So this gentle technique preserves the integrity of these hand-picked ingredients, keeping their beneficial properties intact. And my favorite soap is the beef tallow soap. I absolutely love it. All of their soaps have generous amounts of natural butters and super oils, just great gifts for your friends for Christmas. So if you want to check them out, go to speronaturalgoods.com, and that's spelled SPERO. Use my code Alisa to get 10% off of any order. Again, that's speronaturalgoods.com. Use my code Alisa. That story made me sick to my stomach, the way that it was spun to almost persuade everyone that it was the pro-life laws that killed her, when in reality, it was the abortion pill that is not safe. It's killing all sorts of people. It's killing the baby, of course, but it's also causing extreme health problems for the moms. And we've done a couple of shows on that. Makes me sick to my stomach. There are two issues that have really caused me to become more vocal about this stuff, and that is the abortion issue, which I've always been really passionate about, but also more recently, just all of the trans laws that are allowing people to mutilate our children when they are not at an age where they can give consent. And we're seeing the backlash of that with a lot of the detransition stories. And it occurs to me, like, if we stay silent, we actually have an opportunity to have a voice and opinion as far as how these things go. And if we let that go, if we abdicate that, then I mean, the progressives who want to do that will be glad for us to be silent so that they can bring
Yeah.
their policies in. There was just a pastor here locally in Nashville. A friend of mine texted me a couple days ago that his whole sermon seems like it was informed by the after party curriculum, but he basically was saying, I want to have Republicans and Democrats in my church. I want us to be known as the kind of church where everybody has all these different opinions. And what would it look like if we were known more for our compassion than we were known for our convictions? And I thought, if that doesn't encapsulate what you're talking about with toxic empathy, I don't know what does. So
Yeah.
I would love for you to comment on that phrase. What if we were more known for our compassion than our convictions?
Well, the distinction of the church from your run of the mill charity is our convictions. That's what makes the church is our belief in Christ. Yes, compassion is good, but compassion, just like any other strong emotion, must be in submission to our convictions. The Christian conviction that Jesus Christ is Lord and that he reigns and that his ways are better. And whenever we have a feeling or whenever we have a value that is not in submission to Christ, well, then of course we become our own gods. And that is even true of something like empathy. That's really the point of my book, that when empathy is your guide rather than submitting your empathy to the truth of God's word, then you end up making very silly and actually deleterious decisions because you are so driven by your emotions toward a person. But I see that equivocation from pastors all the time, and it's funny because they actually feel like they are being bold and they're
Hmm.
being courageous when really you're not saying anything.
Yeah,
Everyone is leaving there being like, okay, but how do I think about abortion? Okay, but what does the Bible say about gender?
yeah,
Okay, but does the Bible have anything to say about immigration? I'm not saying that every pastor has to talk about every single
sure.
issue on the ballot, but these big issues, Pastor, why can't you be the one to offer clarity? Why do they have to go to me or Elisa?
Yeah.
Why do they have to go to Instagram or TikTok? Because they could be going to people that completely lead them astray. Don't you want to be the one to shepherd them in that? So, yeah, that kind of confusion is just not helpful.
And there's like this moral equivalency right now that people are parroting. And it was, this wonderful, sweet Christian person gave me it was the Assemblies of God voting guide from like the 80s.
Mm.
I don't even
Yeah.
remember exactly the year, but it was sort of like, I mean, obviously the Democratic Party in the 80s was totally different than it is today. In fact, I was watching that old show, oh, what's it called? About the White House and oh gosh, I can't
West
remember.
Wing? The
Yes,
West
West
Wing?
Wing. That's the one,
Yes.
West Wing. And
Yes.
the Democrats are like a lot of Republicans today. It's like a totally different thing that was, I mean, still I disagree with them, but totally
Yeah.
different. And yet, so this little voting card was like, well, there's this and there's this, and almost presenting like moral equivalence. And this person was saying, this is how we should be thinking today. And I'm thinking, but it's not the same anymore. Like that was for a different time. This is like people's actual lives are on the line with how we think about these things. And, I mean, we're in a moment where we can't even know what to empathize with or what to be
Yeah.
compassionate about unless we first know what is true. One of the examples we gave in our deconstruction book is that, if you walk in a room and there's a man laying unconscious on the floor and another person standing over them and beating on their chest and maybe even causing bruising, like, well, who do you have compassion for? Well, you have to know what's going on first. If the person who is on the floor has just had a heart attack and the person beating on their chest is having, is doing chest compressions, well, now you know the truth of it to be able to analyze where the compassion goes, what to think is
So
good
true.
about it or true about it. You have to know what's true first. And I think that's a point you
Yes.
make really well in your book. So the different types of lies that you're dealing with is abortion is healthcare, trans women are women, love is love, no human is illegal, and social justice is justice. And you go really deep into all of these topics. I'd love to talk about number 3, which is love is love. I think that was a really confusing one when those signs started popping up on everyone's lawn and people were saying love is love. And you're like, well, yeah, but you can't define something by using the word to describe the word you're trying to
Yeah.
define. It's kind of like that What is a Woman documentary of Matt Walsh when he was saying, can you
Exactly.
define woman without using the word woman? And the person couldn't do
Yeah.
it. So talk
Yeah.
about love is
Exactly.
love and what does that mean and how can we think about that as Christians?
Yes, and that's a pattern that I noticed when I was researching this book. Of course, I had heard all of these phrases before, like love is love, social justice is justice, trans women are women, no human is illegal, abortion is healthcare. But I'm like, wow, they really do that with everything. They come up with these circular mantras and never bother to define their terms, which is the sign of really good propaganda. Really
Yeah.
good propaganda sounds so good, yet is so nonsensical that your brain can't even think about how to refute it. Love is love sounds so airtight that a lot of people are like, well, I don't know what to say to that. I guess that's true. That does look like love. But when you start to ask yourself a simple question, what do you mean by, which is just a great tactic in any conversation, especially with someone using euphemisms, what do you mean by healthcare? What do you mean by love? Love can't be love because, like, what? Predation is love, lust is love, stalking is love. Let's define our terms here. And as Christians, we know that God is love, 1 John 4:8. Therefore, he gets to define it. And he does so clearly. He tells us what love is in 1 Corinthians 13. And one of the many qualities of love we read in verse 6, which is love never rejoices in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. So that means we cannot love someone and lie to them. That means we cannot allow our empathy to affirm lies or to lead in a direction that is harmful for the person as God defines harmful. Love has to mean seeking what is best for a person as God defines best, and seeking what is true for a person as God defines truth. So that is a very different thing than empathy. Empathy really isn't a virtue in and of itself. It can lead you to the virtue of love and compassion and selflessness, or it can lead you to being so blinded by your feelings that you forget about everything else and everyone else on the other side of the moral equation. And that is certainly true when it comes to the issue of the definition of marriage. I talk about Glennon Doyle. You and your audience
Mhm.
are very familiar because
Yep.
you've written so well about her and just her ideology. But I tell her story in a hopefully compelling way so that at the end of it, after they read about her divorce and then finding Abby Wambach and falling in love and getting so called married to her and feeling so liberated and free and happy and one big joyous family, that they would feel like, okay, maybe that's fine. I mean, how does that hurt me? How does that harm me? And so, of course, in the chapter, we talk about the biblical reality of marriage, which we can get into. But we also talk about what I found a little bit harder to kind of parse out, but just the practical implications and the political consequences of redefining a natural institution of marriage. and what that means for children, how reproductive technology has played a role in creating motherless and fatherless children, the effects of fatherlessness, the effects of motherlessness, institutionalizing sin, which makes it a lot harder for those people to repent
Yeah.
themselves. And so we can get into any of those directions. But yeah, this is probably a very controversial chapter, even for conservatives, because it's kind of a battle that many conservatives abandoned several years ago.
Yeah, they did, and it seems like with, I remember when this was the talk, everybody was like, "Is this gonna happen? Is this gonna be are we gonna change the definition of marriage?" And even Christians were saying, "What is it? It's not gonna affect your life. If marriage gets redefined, it's not gonna affect your life," which was a total lie because I think that we're seeing the fallout of that now. The redefinition of marriage has led to all of this other cultural chaos that we see. And when you think about like the three institutions that God actually instituted, marriage and family, the church, and the government. And it's interesting that Christians are okay with the church being one of the institutions that God instituted. And we can talk about that. But when it comes to family and marriage, it's like we feel like we just have to step out of that argument. Or when it comes to government, we have to step out and just not be involved in that. And that's really sad because I think the point you're making is that there are victims of that mentality. Like when we step out and just kind of throw our hands up and say, whatever, it's all crazy. I'm just not going to get involved, then there are going to be victims from us doing that. And I've often thought about this too, and then I'll throw it to you for some comments. But you know, a lot of people, and I have people in my life who have said things like this, like, if you look at the first century Christians, they weren't super political. They weren't really trying to overthrow Rome. They were just doing good works. They were being Christians. They were spreading the gospel. We need to do more of that. And it was actually Os Guinness. I heard him answer this so profoundly, where he said, here's the difference. The difference is that in the first century Roman Empire, it was an oppressive empire. They had no power, they had no vote. Nobody cared what you thought. You didn't have political power to protect people. Whereas today, we do. We have a voice. I was just listening to a podcast from Frank Turek with Bill Federer about the history of pietism and things in the US, and talking about how with a monarchy, you have a king, but what we have is we are all like it's the people that rule. So we are actually the king. And what Bill Federer was saying is that if you abdicate your responsibility, you're actually just being a bad king. And so I'll throw it over to you for some commentary on that.
Yes. I mean, we live in this amazing system, which was birthed, starting really, you could say, with the Magna Carta and was advanced through the Protestant Reformation. And then, of course, the British Empire and then our revolution here in America. We have this concept of lex rex, that the law is king. And we live in a country that is supposed to be for the people, by the people, of the people. Our government is supposed to be that. Now, does it work itself out like that practically today? Not as much, but that is the system that the founders envisioned. That's what is supposed to be made manifest today. And we get to exercise our right to uphold the Constitution through our vote. And so we have this amazing privilege. And God didn't place any of us here at this time in this country arbitrarily and accidentally. We get this great privilege of being able to exercise our vote. There are many Christians around the world today who do not have that privilege. That right is not recognized, but we do. And God didn't place you in one of those countries, He placed you here. And yes, we should share the gospel. Yes, we should be taking care of others. Yes, we should be a light in our community, but none of that is exclusive of our political advocacy. We can know that Jesus is coming back, that He is King, that one day we will have no more elections, we will have no more politics, there will be no more issues. We can live joyfully and victoriously in light of that. And still realize that we occupy this physical temporal space and have been given certain responsibilities. I often think of Jeremiah 29 when Israel's in exile in Babylon. Everyone knows Jeremiah 29:11, but there's another verse in Jeremiah 29 that says, while you are in exile, seek the welfare of the city that I have placed you in. And even though America isn't ancient Israel, obviously Christians are exiles in this world. And it seems like the same principle would apply, that we should be seeking the welfare of the city God has placed us in. There are many ways to do that that have nothing to do with politics. But because politics affects people, politics is one way to seek the welfare of our neighbor. That's how I'm thinking of it. And that's why I think it matters so much. And you're totally right, too, about the issues that are at stake. We're talking about existential, moral, theological, creation order
Yeah.
issues. I heard a pastor say recently, it's not that our theology has become more political, it's that politics have become more theological. And when
Mm,
politics intercepts or interjects itself into the church's realm, the church has to stand up and say,
that's
not
right.
so fast.
Very
And
good. Yeah.
even Christians in ancient Rome, I mean, if you read the first chapter of the church to the Romans, I mean, Paul was pretty clearly saying the things that we're trying to say too. Like, this disordered sexuality, this
Yeah.
worshiping the creature rather than the creator, these people who basically mock God with their behavior and their words, like they will see destruction. And to speak that into that culture at the time, or at least to the Christians in the culture at the time, even though they didn't have the power to vote on those issues, they represented those issues. That is why
Yep.
over time, that
That's right.
widespread practice of infanticide and exposure and widespread abortion and treating slaves and women and children as if they were these sexually expendable objects, that's why over time that came to an end. It wasn't
Yeah.
Christians vying for power, creating empire or whatever. It was Christians being Christians.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that Christians should continue to be Christians.
Yeah. Salt and light, right? Okay, Allie, tell us all the things. Tell us about your podcast, where they can get the book,
Yeah.
all the things.
Yeah, so Relatable is anywhere you get your podcast. You can watch on YouTube Monday through Thursday, but you can also listen wherever you listen. And then Toxic Empathy, you can buy it on Amazon. You could also go to toxicempathy.com. If Amazon is not your thing, you can see other places to buy it. I think it's available at Hobby Lobby too. So if you want to go in person and get it, you can. Also available on Audible. I'm on social media. I'll probably come up if you type in my name. You can go to alliebethstuckey.com too. There's more information there.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank my guest, Allie Beth Stuckey. Can't recommend her materials, her podcast. I listen to her podcast regularly. Absolutely love her voice. So pick up the book, listen to the podcast. And also, if you are listening on audio platforms, I always say this, but I really mean it. I'm so thankful to the thousands of you who have left great reviews on Apple and all the different places. If you haven't yet, would you please consider leaving a good review? It just helps get this message out into the news feeds of more people. And of course, share this out. Share this episode with your pastors or with your friends who maybe you've been having some of these discussions with. And let's remember that as we pursue Christ, let's keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.